Greetings, it's time for another monthly update on monetary creation. This is one of the most awaited videos on this channel because it is inherent to the central thesis of this channel, which is that technological deflation is exponential and accelerating, and all quantitative easing is being consumed by that. And that's why with so much monetary creation, money printing, we still see very little inflation, contrary to the narrative that exists out there, which we shall also examine. So as always, we go to our Yardeni report, the URL for which will be in the description box below. This is produced by Dr. Ed Yardeni, and this is his contact information in case you ever want to contact him. And we scroll down. First, the four major central banks of the world. They comprise about 90% of all the world's monetary creation. The US Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and the People's Bank of China. And as you can see, for all the media screeching about how the Federal Reserve has printed too much money, it's actually not the largest printer, and certainly not the largest relative to the size of the US economy, as we will see in a few minutes. Europe has done more money printing than the United States. You would think Europeans are the ones most worried about printing money and the chance for high inflation, but they have actually done more than the United States. So these are the four central banks of the world and how much they have printed since 2007. And as you can see, the United States is only 25% of the total. So whether the United States prints more or actually deprints, that has only a limited effect on the grand total. And only the grand total matters because technology is worldwide and monetary creation is also worldwide, and therefore the interaction between these two is worldwide. It is borderless. Therefore, to believe certain things like the Federal Reserve is printing so much money, that's why gold will go up, is absurd, because that implies that the United States is the only country in the world, even though gold is a commodity that is priced worldwide. And that's one of the many reasons gold has not risen in price at all, despite so many years of trillions upon trillions of dollars of money printing. And that's why people like Peter Schiff and all these other gold bug type people who have been recommending that people buy gold have been wrong. In fact, gold is about the same price as 10 years ago. So only the grand total matters, and for that we go to the next chart over here. This is the total of those four major central banks, and the grand total that has been done is $29.5 trillion of monetary creation, money printing. 29.5 trillion. It's down somewhat because now we're in a tightening cycle. This is what should not be done, as I repeat throughout this channel, because this exponential curve is very evident, and because they're tightening now, they're only going to end up doing more later on, as has happened in 2018 and 19. The market corrects, the stock market plunges, and the economy goes into recession or at the precipice of recession, and the central banks of the world have to print more just to avoid that recession, and they're forced back onto this exponential curve, which matches very well the percentage of the total economy that is high-tech versus low-tech, and this deflation is matched up to this monetary creation. So even this deprinting that has occurred so far, as little as it is, as you can see, we're already $3 or $4 trillion behind where we should be. And just to catch up in a year, the central banks of the world will have to go from here all the way up to here. So 6 or 7 trillion more, even if they were to resume money printing, but they're still deprinting at the moment. So they're going further and further away from where they should be, and that will cause a further stock market correction and the potential of a recession. And we'll wait and see how long they let things get bad before they admit they were wrong and start printing again, as has happened 4 or 5 times already. Every time they try to tighten, they end up having to do more because they don't understand that the natural order of things is now for permanent quantitative easing by central banks. So this is the grand total. But what really matters is the year-over-year gradient, because this is an exponentially rising curve. So we go to the next chart. Now, people familiar with my atom thesis know I say this number has to increase by 16 to 24% a year. This is the same chart as the one we just saw above, but the percentage year-over-year growth rate. So it's rarely in the correct band of 16 to 24%, and above 24%, that is where I say could be too much and possibly cause structural inflation. Now, in February of 2021, which was a year and a half ago, it got as high as 46.3% year-over-year growth. It really probed the ceiling of how much is too much money printing, and that's why we are seeing a slight inflation spike in the months following this. But a lot of that is not because of quantitative easing. It is because of a deliberate stoppage of domestic oil and natural gas production in the US, which has boosted energy prices by, again, a deliberate reduction in supply. But this 46.3% year-over-year growth in February of 2021 did not cause any inflation at that time because this oil-driven inflation spike happened about a year later. And now we're down to negative, minus 1.9%. The optimal cruising speed is for this line to be between 16 and 24%. So around here, 16 to 24%, they're at minus 1.9%. The only other time they went negative was in 2019, which caused a major stock market crash. And of course, they had to print much more independent of the COVID-19 pandemic. They're at minus 1.9%. Just to get back to 16% would require a major reversal in their ideology and their understanding of the relationship between quantitative easing and inflation, and they never seem to learn because they make the same mistake again and again and again. PhD economists are very theoretical people, and they have memorized a lot of economic textbooks from the middle of the 20th century, and that's why a lot of their thought is about 70 years behind the times. They have no comprehension of exponential technological deflation, as is proven by how they overshoot each time. They do too much and then they clamp it down too severely. And too much is not a problem. It's just a question of waiting out until the too much drops back into the optimal band over here. So it's really hard to overshoot. But in undershooting, they cause all sorts of other problems, such as recessions and millions of jobs lost and things like that. And now we go to this next chart. This is the same chart as the first one we saw, except as a percentage of the GDP of the country or group of countries doing this quantitative easing. Again, for all the screeching about the US Federal Reserve printing so much money, it's the joint lowest of the four as a percentage of total US GDP. Now, yes, this is cumulative printing of money, and GDP is an annual metric, but all four of these have that same annual metric as the denominator of their data. The United States has done an amount of quantitative easing over the last 15 years that is only 36.3% of US GDP. China is about the same. Europe, the people who are supposedly the most afraid of high inflation, has done about twice as much, 67.4%. Nobody says Europe has unusually high inflation. But the highest of all is Japan. They have done 4 times as much as the US as a portion of Japan's GDP, 134.8%, and even the people who say US inflation is extremely high and the US inflation numbers are deliberately manipulated to understate inflation, none of those people say Japan has high inflation. So the people who say quantitative easing causes inflation really don't know what's going on because they cannot explain this Japan situation, whereas I have just explained it. These individual country numbers don't matter, only the grand total matters. And the grand total has to rise by 16 to 24% a year. That's why Japan can do so much and not have domestic inflation, because a lot of Japan's QE flows into the US and China, which are doing too little QE, and only that grand total matters because monetary creation is entirely borderless, because technology is entirely borderless. Now we go to the next chart, which is my scorecard of my prediction for quantitative easing for this decade versus that of the PhD economist super theoreticians. As you can see over here, on January 1st, 2020, the start of this 2020s decade, the entire economics establishment thought that the 23 trillion that had been printed by that time would be completely reversed. And so their prediction for the 2020s was a negative 23 trillion rate of money printing, effectively a deprinting and a reversal of all prior quantitative easing done in the 2010s. We of course know that's not true, and my prediction was for QE to be exponential. I said that it would be $50 to $100 trillion of new printing in the 2020s. 50 trillion if it is in the form of cash sent directly to people, which is what it's going to have to be. Market forces are in fact going in that direction. And 100 trillion if it is in the same form as is being done right now, which is bond buying. But I think this bond buying paradigm is going to break. So the PhD economist establishment, full of super theoretical people, they insisted that the first 23 trillion would be undone. And I said that it would keep rising exponentially. There's not going to be any undoing in a net sense. So where are we? We're about 2.5 years into this decade, so about a quarter of the decade so far, and despite the slight deprinting that we have seen, we are still at plus 9.5 trillion this decade so far, and this would have happened independent of COVID. So 9.5 trillion, and remember this is exponential, 1/4 of the time passed does not mean that 1/4 of this amount would be done. The latter part of this decade would have much more because of the exponential nature of this. So far things are tracking much more towards my prediction than theirs. They actually think negative 23 trillion, and in 2.5 years we've done plus 9.5, so it's tracking into my zone completely. The entire economics profession is so theoretical that they just cannot consider results and why what they're doing is not working, because whenever reality conflicts with their theoretical models, they're quite content to ignore reality, because their profession does not reward accuracy of predictions. It rewards repeating the same memorized dogma back and forth among other PhD economists who have memorized the same dogma. It's a complete closed system, and that's why new ideas can never come from that ultra closed off ivory tower. There is no major field in this world that is more out of touch with the changes in their own subject matter than economics. They are just as far afield as the mechanical engineering establishment was in 1901, when they were absolutely certain that heavier than air flying machines were not possible. And when someone did demonstrate heavier than air flying machines, they were still in denial. And PhD economists are such that if they were the establishment at that time, they would deny the existence of airplanes all the way up to 1940. It would take the Battle of Britain for them to finally admit that there have been airplanes for the prior 40 years, heavier than air flying machines. That is how hyper-theoretical and incredibly dismissive of the facts of the real world PhD economists are. They have predicted 100 of the last 0 bouts of hyperinflation. This takes us to part 2 of this video, where we look at the inflation scorecard to see whether this much quantitative easing has actually caused any aberrant inflation, and how inflation is tracking across a multi-dimensional and worldwide assessment of inflation, not the screeching you hear from the soundbite heavy media. So we go to part 2. The media has persuaded a large portion of the population that inflation has been high for 10 years. Even if they didn't think inflation was high 4 months ago, now suddenly they think it has been really high for 10 years or more. So I'm going to debunk all of that in this video over here. Now, as always, we go to the 3 metrics I've chosen to get the most multidimensional assessment of inflation for maximum international measurement, as well as measurement across freely traded items, thereby avoiding accusation that this metric is manipulated to deliberately understate inflation, and I will show you how that narrative is completely false and can be easily debunked. So first is the US CPI, 10-year compound annual growth rate. The second is the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, also 10-year compound annual growth rate. And the third is the 10-year US Treasury yield. And I choose an unusually low number here, 3%, because for most of the last half century it has been much more than 3%, but now we are in an age of technological deflation, which the market is already pricing in, and it's very hard for this number to get above 3%, even though the Federal Reserve is in fact raising the Fed funds rate, the front end of the yield curve. This is not being pushed higher to maintain a 3% spread in the yield curve, which is normally what correlates to a robust economy. It is resulting in a flat yield curve, indicating that the Federal Reserve is taking the wrong action. And yes, a 10-year window is necessary, because people screech about 1-year inflation rates being high, but these same people are nowhere to be found when the 1-year inflation rate is low. And these are people who are more driven by the media narrative of the day rather than any holistic or data-driven assessment. And people who criticize taking a more data-driven and unemotional approach to this whole assessment of whether we are actually in high inflation or not are rather innumerate at this point. I will use that word, innumerate, to describe them. So for symmetry, I choose 3%, 3%, 3%, and I need all 3 of these numbers to be above 3% before I say that inflation is higher than optimal. If all 3 were exactly 3%, I would actually call that optimal. That is when technological progress is the highest relative to the least amount of pain for the general public. Remember, deflation would be catastrophically bad for the general public, as I explain in this video up here on the right hand side. A lot of people don't realize that. They think all inflation is bad and all deflation is good, and they couldn't be more wrong, because deflation would lead to massive job losses, far more than slightly above trend inflation. But I require all 3 to be above 3%. This is a very low bar as per 20th century economic realities, but in a technological age, this bar is proving quite difficult to surmount, as we shall soon see. So the first one we'll go to is the US CPI. So this is the bls.gov website. Go to prior month videos to see how I access the inflation chart. And in formatting options, I have chosen 1 month, 2 month, 3 month, and 12 month as metrics that we are going to look at in terms of windows of time. But this is the CPI number itself. Looks pretty scary, seems to be rising exponentially. So what is the 10-year compound annual growth rate? So we take the calculator and we take this number, which is 295, divided by the number exactly 10 years prior, which is 229. 295 divided by 229. So 1.288. So 28.8% is the inflation over 10 years. Now what is that per year? So we take the 10th root of that, which is 0.1. I hope everyone understands the arithmetic of how this works. That's 1.0256. So you minus 1 and multiply by 100, so that's 2.56% average annual growth rate of the CPI, and we round that up to the first decimal, so 2.6%. I do round it up even if that would be slightly unfavorable to my prediction set, because I'm very confident in my entire atom thesis of technological deflation. So 2.6% is the compound annual growth rate of the CPI over the period in question. Now as we go down, this is the 1 month metric. It's already kind of flattening. It rose a lot, but it's not rising at the same steep rate anymore. Same goes for the 2 month. Now 3 month looks like it's steeper because this is the max amount of the gradient. And this is the 1 year. This is what looks really scary, but it rose this fast. It can fall this fast too. And it rose, of course, because the United States made the overt decision to block domestic oil and natural gas production, or at least greatly discourage and inhibit it, and that has caused oil and natural gas to rise for reasons that have nothing to do with quantitative easing, because quantitative easing was going on for 12 years before this, as we all know. So this is the 1 year growth rate that everyone fixates on, but the same people were nowhere to be found over here when we were drifting into deflation, as well as over here when it was zero for well over a year, and how this entire period was kind of low. So the average of all of this going back 10 years, starting from July of 2012 to now, is 2.56% or 2.6%. So that was the first number. Now we go to the next one, Goldman Sachs Commodity Index. Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, the link for this will be in the description box below, of course. 10-year compound annual growth rate, 0.58%, still pretty low, nowhere near 3%. It got rather close to 3% a few months prior, but it just couldn't sustain that much growth. And now it's back down to 0.58%. This number is pretty volatile and can jump around a bit. That's why I insist that all three of those numbers be above 3%. But this is only 0.58%, absolutely nothing to worry about. Commodities are barely avoiding deflation on this 10-year compound annual growth rate measurement. So now we go to the third and final metric, which is the 10-year U.S. Treasury yield. 10-year U.S. Treasury yield, 2.93%, so pretty close to 3%. Last month it was above 3%. But you see how difficult it is for this to go above 3%. It peaks above it for a very short while, maybe just a day, and drifts below again. Peaks above and drifts below. This is a pretty hard ceiling, and I predicted this months before it ever rose that high. I started using this metric many months ago over here because I knew 3% is when the difficulty becomes exponential. This is a 2-year chart. Let me take a 5-year chart. See, it was above 3% in 2018, but that too only for a few days. It was not above that for much longer than that. And if one takes a 40-year chart, so 1980 to present, more than 40 years, it has been above 3% for so long that the fact that it's difficult to go above 3% now kind of proves how much technological diffusion there is and how exponential technological deflation is a reality. Even in the 1990s, rates of 6 to 7% were normal. In the 2000s, 4 to 5% was normal. Now it's having a lot of trouble getting above 3%, and that too only because the United States has raised the Fed funds rate and is selling the treasuries that it had bought. So now it is selling treasuries, lowering the price of treasury bonds and increasing the yield, but still only 2.93%. So now we go back and look at all three of these measurements in tandem. So US CPI 10-year compound annual growth rate, Goldman Sachs Commodity Index 10-year compound annual growth rate, and 10-year US Treasury yield. Today is July 15, 2022. So what are all three numbers now on the same chart? 2.6% for the CPI as we saw, 0.58% for the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, but this is pretty volatile as we've seen, so it can get close to 3% and fall back down really fast. And 2.93% for the 10-year US Treasury yield. This is having difficulty going above 3% because the difficulty rises exponentially. That's what a lot of people don't understand. That's why I could say with confidence that such a low threshold a threshold that is much lower than what this yield was for most of the prior 40 years before the age of QE and the age of the atom being large enough to generate an amount of technological deflation that's meaningful to get to 3%. Now it has a lot of trouble breaking 3%. So as we can see, we are quite far from the point at which all three of these numbers are above 3%. Remember, all three have to be above 3%. Not just one of them above 3% or not just the average of them above 3%. All three have to be above 3% because this is an unriggable metric. The Goldman Sachs Commodity Index is a basket of freely traded commodities, oil, natural gas, gold, everything, and therefore cannot be rigged. 10-year U.S. Treasury yield also cannot be rigged because this is freely traded. So we are still far from a point where inflation is high. Inflation is not even optimal. Now, I don't mean to be heartless by saying that, but the short-term inflation spike is exactly that, short-term. It has done very little to move up this 10-year compound annual growth rate, and it is about to fall very quickly because demand destruction and technological adaptation around high oil prices has already manifested, and oil is significantly off its highs. And remember, a deliberate government policy goal of increasing the price of oil and natural gas in order to create more inflation and to reduce the consumption of oil and natural gas is the only reason for this temporary inflation spike. It would not have even occurred if the Biden administration had not stopped domestic oil and natural gas production, and Republicans are culpable in this too, so it's not a partisan thing. They don't seem to be troubled by it, even though this could be seen as one of the best things to happen to the U.S. economy in a lot of years. The Republican Party is not out there defending fracking or anything outside of a small fraction of those politicians. Now, I'm not a fan of a government policy that tries to force demand destruction along at an unnatural pace. They should not have stopped domestic oil and natural gas production because demand destruction of oil was already occurring. Electric vehicles are selling more and more, as evident from a number of videos on this channel. But there's even higher level disruptions like the work from home revolution where people aren't even commuting anymore, and therefore that gasoline consumption has disappeared entirely. It's not even being replaced by electrical vehicles. Electrical vehicles are only the number 2 disruption. The higher disruption in the hierarchy is the Zoom video conferencing telework revolution. And that is also very deflationary. Deflationary towards oil prices, deflationary towards the number of cars that sells, so the percentage of household income that goes into automobiles, and deflationary towards real estate, as I speak about in many videos on this channel. So no, inflation is not high. This CPI number, it takes a lot to move it high, but also takes a lot to move it down. So this is chosen quite fairly, I would say. This is edging up towards 3%. And if it gets to 3%, still has a long way to go, then it'll take a lot to make it lower. But then you have these two as well, which are freely traded, and the narrative of the inflation measurements being rigged just cannot possibly apply when these numbers are in fact so low and have been for such a long time. Now, if you found this video to be informative and a welcome intervention of reality against the media narrative that is designed to frighten people in all dimensions, the extent of inflation and how long it's been high, then I encourage you to subscribe to this channel, and thank you very much for watching.